I've spent a lot of time in the last year or two talking about what I think is wrong with the left, because I'm a liberal and I want the left to be liberal again. And now we have Trump, which brings this whole other set of problems. And people say to me, well, you're not attacking him enough. And it's like, well, we now have this X factor and everything is kind of upside down right now. And I guess it's incumbent on people like us to pave the way for other people, because they're waiting, right?
Well, I mean, let's get to Trump for a second, because to me, you had started out with talking about ideologies. Mm-hmm. This is a different thing entirely. First of all, I always say, if you could have had a crystal ball during the campaign and you could have shown who the nominees for various official positions would have been, Trump doesn't get elected no matter who he runs against. And I don't think he gets elected if he's running against even Joe Biden, who I consider to be, kind of a zero. I think Biden runs away with it. I think he's a manifestation of our dissatisfaction with the political system, which we are. I mean, I don't know anybody who's satisfied with it.
Right.
And at the same time, it's not necessarily going to take us away from our problems, because our problems are too much power in the presidency, not enough attention paid to the Constitution, and the fact that we've gotten away from the various things that make America great, which is things like the separation of powers, checks and balances. But the tendency of Americans is to blame things on, for example, the last administration or something. This is 50 years of trends building on top of trends. This is not a new thing. And every president in my lifetime has taken us farther down the road to what presidential historian Schlesinger called the imperial presidency. Well, now it's the hyper-imperial presidency. We have a Congress that reminds you of the Roman Senate at the end, where if you say, what is the real skill level that you possess as a senator, it's fundraising, right? Lawrence Lessig, the Harvard law professor, had said that, he diagrammed how you work your way up through the political system now. And the first thing they asked you when you want to be a small town mayor somewhere, but have a little D or a little R by your name, is how good are you at fundraising.
Yeah.
So by the time you actually achieve a higher office, what was the number one qualification they were looking for the whole way?
Yeah.
That you were a good legislator? None of those things. So these people, I had a grandmother who was this amazing fundraiser, and she would raise funds for charity, she would go to these events, and that's what these people are good at.
Yeah.
So it should surprise us very little when you say, okay, we need a check and balance here, and they're not there. They're only there. Now, they'll be there if their contributors want them to be there, or if they can make political hay. But in terms, you watch the Republicans now in Congress, and if it wasn't so serious, it's fun to watch, because these people are some of the most astute hedgers you've ever seen in your life. But they don't know how to hedge now on this one. They're sitting there at a fork in the road going, do I cast my lot with the Trump administration? Is he going to be a big star and a hero in 10 years, in which case I turned the right turn at Albuquerque and it worked out?
Right.
Or is he going to be seen as a disaster and anyone who was aligned with him is, a nightmare? So do I need to they don't know what to do, and all they want to do is figure out the way where they're going to turn out the best so that I get reelected or whatever down the road. All of these people are so concerned about a job that they should only do temporarily anyway, that it's warped their entire ability to have anything connected to what we would call leadership today.
Yeah, you've hit on so many things that I talk about all the time on the show, about separation of powers and an imperial presidency.
It's obvious. It should be obvious.
Right, and why we should be governed by the Constitution and not just by the whims of current events and things like that. So the imperial presidency, I think, is a really interesting thing, because I've been on the record for years that when George W. Bush was doing all the executive actions, I was against them. When Obama was doing them, I was against them. I'm against them now. Now we have a guy who's obviously willing to govern fully by them.
An authoritarian.
Yeah.
Yes.
Who's willing to govern by them. But it's like, it's not only his fault. It's not his fault for grabbing the power that has
somebody
been
was
ceded
going
to him. Somebody was going to do it.
Somebody was going to.
So is that the best argument for limited government then? That forget what your politics are on specific issues, that these people that want money and want re-elections and that are okay to be authoritarians, the only fight against them is to rein in the power they have over us.
Let's talk about that for a minute, because that's another one of those terms, just like we were talking about at the beginning, with liberal and conservative, all these things that are hard to define a real meaning. Who has a limited government in the world? What country in the world has
that's a functioning country?
No, a limited government. Who has that? Because the truth is we have a country here that has 300 million people. We have a budget that is enormous.
Yeah.
We have needs that are incredible. how could you have a limited government?
Well, limited, I would argue limited meaning that it should just do less. It should have a little less control over us, meaning that it should take less from us. So lower taxes as a general thing. We could probably scale back the military a little bit. We could probably scale back some social services and they might be taken over a little more by private enterprise, that sort of thing. I don't mean that we should dismantle the government and not, have driver's licenses.
But the problem is that you end up, if you take away, if you go and you started to remove things, you would find out, I think, it's a belief, so because we don't do this, so it's all theoretical, right?
That's fine.
But the belief is that if you took away this stuff, you would find out why it appeared in the first place. Now, does that mean it's going to come back in a form that's as bloated? And because we all understand that the government has built-in budgetary increases every year, which is, again, you would say part of the problem. This is where zero balance budgeting and all that stuff comes into play. The real wake-up call for Americans, and it's funny because if I could do anything, if you wanted to say, I'm going to cut the defense budget by 2/3 and I'm going to give every American a travel budget where they can go around the world and begin to see how other countries work, because the biggest nightmare for Americans in terms of upsetting all your beliefs is to go to some of these other countries and be shocked that it works. I mean, go to Scandinavia. Now, Scandinavia would not work here because the entire system is dependent upon you being Scandinavian.
Right, it's basically a homogeneous society.
Oh, well, and I had a Scandinavian girlfriend, and we were getting on the freeway here in Los Angeles, and as you know, getting on the freeway in Los Angeles is a struggle.
Yeah.
I mean, you have. And she looked at me and she said, this is what's wrong with America. She goes, in Sweden, it would be left hand would go, right hand would go, left hand would go. And I said, that's what's wrong with you people. I said, that's why you can't compete like we can, because we fight for everything, right? I mean, even getting on the freeway is a struggle. But when you go there, what's shocking to an American is that they have a system that would not work here, but it works there. And they don't tell you when you're growing up these things. I mean, you have to actually see it.
Yeah.
Now, what that means is you come back here and you say, okay, government is not necessarily, we're kind of taught sometimes that government is necessarily inefficient and can't work. And I always say that that's a defeatist attitude. Back when the Clinton-Gore White House was brand new, they had a program that they called, had a great name, great marketing, it's looked at reinventing government. And the idea was that this is not necessarily the way government has to be, right? Could we improve it? Could we make it better? And what I'm always suggesting is we really haven't tried. And remember, it's a big bureaucracy. Even if you decide you want to go in and change it, it's hard to change. I mean, I think what you're going to find out with Trump is he's going to find out pretty darn soon that the bureaucracy has a lot of ability to push back.
Right. So when I talk limited government, for me, it's about dismantling some of that bureaucracy so that potentially we could maybe get to some of that Clinton-Gore stuff.
For me, when I look at the system, the one thing that we could do that would affect the lives of average Americans the least in terms of cutting big government is change the foreign policy. Because when you look at discretionary spending, and as we all know, many of the things like Medicare, that's not discretionary. Social Security, those are not discretionary spending. The military, though, is. And remember that if you go actually look at a 1960 budget for the U.S. military and a budget now, it's totally apples and oranges because of the way they've deliberately hidden things. So the 1960 budget, for example, the Veterans Affairs costs are all built into the defense budget. Now it's a separate part of the budget. So when you'll hear somebody say, well, we don't spend that much on defense now, well, but deliberately apples and oranges, like so much of the budget. Same thing with unemployment numbers. I mean, you can't compare the ones in the old days to now because we exclude people that haven't been looking for work, right? Okay, so when you look at the amount of money we spend, and you say, that's free money. That's money you could allocate elsewhere, right? So when you talk about cutting government, what would happen if you cut the defense budget in half? I think we're still the largest military spending country in the world. By the way, I should point out that we have a Department of Defense, and yet Americans have not fought on American soil. My mother's 80 years old. She was 2 the last time Americans fought on American soil. What is that money buying us? So when you talk about well-spent funds, is there a lot of waste and fraud in Medicare? Darn right there is. But through the government pipeline, people are being helped on the other end. Who's being helped by the defense budget, right? When I bring this up, I'm called an isolationist, which is a term that goes back to the 1940s. It has all sorts of baggage on purpose. All I want is a government with a foreign policy like every other government in the world. How can that by definition be isolationist? How many bases outside of Russia does Russia have, which is probably the next most interventions? I think you can count them on one hand, okay? We have in excess of 125, maybe more, used to be 180, and you pay for that as a taxpayer.
Right.
What do you get for that?
Right. Well, is this where Trump actually made headway with things? Because he would say, well, why do we have bases in Japan? Shouldn't they be
shifted,
paying
he's done
forgetting the moral
Yeah.
center that we may not be sure about. But if you're just the average person, because he basically made the argument you're making, why isn't Japan paying us to protect them? So he's making the sort of same argument that you're laying out there, right? Maybe not as well thought out.
Well, no, but it's a good point. And
Yeah.
the reason he made it, though, is the reason that every president you could think of makes the argument, and that is that the United States public has been and always is, except in the most extreme situations, of a mind that they don't want that. And when you go look at how this started between 1945 and 1952 is when the country made a huge change in foreign policy, and we've never looked back. They knew. You could read the Truman administration and the things that they knew that the people didn't want this because it's natural. They say, why am I spending money for this, that, or the other thing? That's why George W. Bush ran for a more humble foreign policy. That's why President Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt both won elections before they took us into world wars on promises to keep you out of world wars. There's no president that runs for the United States top job and says, if you elect me, we're going to be in more foreign countries. It doesn't happen because the electorate doesn't want that, and yet that's what we get.
So what does that say then? Because if you think about it, when Obama ran the first time, one of the reasons he beat Hillary in the primary was because he was harder on getting out of Iraq immediately. That was one of the reasons he was able to get through the primary to beat her. Yet at the same time, I think he's the only president we've ever had that his entire 8 years, we were at war. We've been in Afghanistan for this entire 8 years. We're still there. We don't even know. I mean, I don't think anyone has any clue why we're there anymore.
I think you need to define war because
Right,
I was going to say,
also-
I don't think we've not been at war since 1947, probably, since the Truman Doctrine. But it depends on what you mean. I mean, is it war if you're funding war somewhere else, or is it only war if your people are actually fighting and dying? Because we've been funding war. And understand, there's a whole rationale, it's called military Keynesianism, that, and you can go back and read the documents at the time, they're very open about it. We had the Great Depression, and they tried all kinds of things to get us out of that. We were still in it when the gin-up 1940 to the Second World War started. And you go look at the production numbers and the economic numbers, and the graph is almost straight up, right? So then in 1943, when it's clear that the war will be over in a couple of years, and it's like an arm wrestling match and it's too far ago, they start thinking, okay, well, what happens when we turn off the spigot, right? Because I had a great uncle who had a small little rubber plant in Orange County before the war. When the war started, the government gave him a huge amount of money to buy up all the land. We need all all of it, right? And then after the war, they simply said, do whatever you want with it. So he sold it and made a fortune just on selling the land. But that's the spigot, right? That's the tech. So there was this feeling that we could go right back to the Great Depression if you didn't keep the spigot on, right? This unnatural amount of cash coming from taxpayers to military to build stuff that we might not even need, but it keeps jobs going. That's the thing. If I told you that we could get out of all these countries and the world would be fine, you might say, that sounds great. But if I said, yes, but we could also lose 250,000 jobs of people in the defense sector, then you have to say, okay,
Right.
is it? But then one must ask, are these real jobs, or are these jobs where Dave Rubin's tax dollars are basically transferred to a guy who works in the defense? I mean,
Right.
and is that really capitalism? We go after the socialist countries for being socialist. How different is it? Military Keynesianism is a kind of a socialism.
Right, right. We're just transferring it in a
Yes.
different.
And
in a
then when we
different
don't
way.
want the stuff, this is where it's a bit of a shell game. Because if we were really concerned with defense, you would not give your best equipment to other people, right? You would not say, this is our new M1 Abrams tank and we have it. But then when you give it to other people, what does that mean? That means they have the same stuff you do, which means you got to go build better stuff.
Right.
So it becomes a make-work program, if you will.
So how much of it is just that maybe this thing has grown so big, talking about budgets and military and all that, that reining it back in would almost be impossible. Short of something completely radical, like I would probably be for, I'd have to think it out a little bit further and sit down with some economists on it, I would probably be for like a 20% cut across the entire board for the government, just to cut every department back 20%, mostly because of the bloat and the bureaucracy, because I think you could easily get 20% out of almost everything. But do you think it's possible that we've maybe gotten too big, that somehow turning it back could have repercussions that we can't even imagine?
Well, first of all, start with when you have a corrupt political system, take, for example, the question of tanks. We just brought up tanks. Well, there's a famous story happened, I don't know, 6 months, a year ago, where it was a bit of a scandal because the government doesn't want any more tanks. Military does not want any more tanks. We have lots of them. But they build tanks in important districts that have senators who then go and argue that, you would decimate my local economy if we weren't building. So they're building more tanks than the military says they want because we have to keep the work. See, the military also smart. They locate, and I love the U.S. military, by the way. I'm a military history guy. But they locate the various important facilities in places where there are powerful politicians and what have. So you have a real reason. I mean, if you talk about cutting defense, you're going to have, for example, congressmen down in Southern California who have Marine bases that depend on that money, that feed families, that go into the local economies. But again, do you have a Defense Department for that? Is that what you, and if you got rid of that, does that mean you will suffer, or does that mean, the true believers in capitalism would say, okay, then you will reallocate all that, right? If you believe that, and I'm more of a pragmatist, it's an ideology, but those funds will be relocated to more productive measures. It'll be a form of creative destruction, if you will. I think that's a more logical question. Like if you talk about cutting the defense budget, for example, by 20%, the problem with that is you haven't cut the mission. If your job is to be the global policeman of the world, we're not spending enough now. So you have to match the funding.
Well, I would argue that's a problem too.
Yes,
I think you would agree
have to
with
match
me.
the funding to the mission, right? If our job is to defend the United States of America, we are wildly spending too much money.
Right.
Okay, so here's the thing that never gets debated, and it's like the dog that didn't bark in Sherlock Holmes. The subject we never debate is allowing the American people a voice in the foreign policy. Because if the American people are allowed to decide the foreign policy, we don't have this foreign policy, and everybody knows it. That's why we don't have a voice in that. So that's why we have, and it's the one thing, you want to say one thing about President Trump, he's probably kept more campaign promises than any president I can think of, whether you want those promises or not. But the one he's pivoting on is the foreign policy promise.
So the foreign policy promise, basically people thought he was going to be more of an isolationist, and now...
Don't use that term. That's a slur. You're playing right into it.
Well, that he didn't run on war, let's put it that way. He said we're wasting a lot of money.
Foreign policy more like other countries' foreign policy.
Right, right, which I guess in the American...
We are hyper-interventionists.
Right, so in the American lens, it comes out as if you're an isolationist. But just take care of...
He didn't want to be the hyper-interventionist country anymore.
Yeah, but you suspect that he's actually shifting on that.
The powers, and I don't think he's doing it because he lied. I think you get in there and you don't, the inertia that gets on you. I mean, for example, the Russian thing is fun to watch. I mean, because there's no reason for us to be at odds with Russia. And they'll say,
completely agree.
Putin's this, Putin's that. Okay, what we're going to depend, these leaders now have to be nice. He's a bad guy. I don't think he's a good guy. But that doesn't mean you get into a nuclear war over some miscalculation. I mean, listen, you have international competitors, but that's life. And if your job is, as our military, how do you explain this? We have a policy, and they update it all the time, a giant sort of global policy on our plans for the next 10 years, 20 years. And our main goal, these policies say, is to have no international military competitors. None. If that's your foreign policy goals, you're leading to confrontation. I mean, that ends in confrontation, and it requires an enormous amount of spending because our old goal used to be able to fight 2 wars on opposite sides of the planet at the same time. Who else has a policy like that? So the argument, I read Charles Krauthammer, who I dislike intensely, the other day, and he said what makes America great is global leadership. In other words, I guess we weren't great before 1945. But when you think like that, then it's not freedom, it's not liberty, it's not the Constitution, it's that we are the policemen of the world and we're the big dog, and once we lose that, we're no longer great. How the heck did we ever survive up until the Second World War?